Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to being truly well-informed. Today, we're cracking open a pretty fascinating report from NITI Aayog.
That's India's main public policy think tank. Yeah.
Exactly. Published just this month, July 2025. And it's basically this bold plan for how India wants to transform its chemical industry.
And really boost its role in global supply chains for this sector. It's quite ambitious.
It is. Now, they do add a small note, the usual disclaimer, due care was taken, but they don't officially confirm all the data or methods.
Which is fair. It leaves room for interpretation, which is kind of what we're here to do.
Right. So what immediately jumps out is just the scale we're talking about. India's chemical industry, it's huge already.
Absolutely. A real pillar of the economy. Valued at, what, around $220 billion currently?
But here's the kicker, and this is what gets me. Despite that size, India only accounts for maybe 3.5% of global chemical consumption.
That's the surprising part, isn't it? Such a big economy, relatively small slice of the global pie.
It feels like a disconnect. 3 to 3.5% for a country like India. Does that tell us more about untapped potential or maybe a strategic need for growth?
I think it screams untapped potential. It's not just about the low number itself, it's the opportunity the number represents. We're not talking small steps here.
No, this sounds like a major shift.
It's about repositioning India entirely, making it a really significant, maybe even indispensable player in those global chemical supply chains,
Right.
especially now, with all the geopolitical shifts happening.
Good point. So our mission today really is to cut through the jargon in this report.
Yeah, pull out the key facts, maybe some surprising ones about where India's chemical sector stands now.
And then unpack these ambitious plans they have laid out, show you how they plan to tackle the challenges and, unlock all that potential.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's get that clearer picture first. Where does India actually stand right now in the global chemical landscape?
Well, its footprint is already pretty significant. India is the world's sixth largest chemical producer overall.
Sixth largest, okay.
And third largest in Asia, so not small fry. And it's vital. Domestically contributes about 7% to the national GDP.
Wow, 7%. That's substantial.
It really is.
Yeah.
And think about what it feeds into. It's applying essential raw materials, the basic building blocks for critical industries. We're talking pharmaceuticals, textiles, automotive, agriculture.
So many downstream sectors depend on it.
Exactly. Without a strong chemical base, many of those other industries just wouldn't function at the scale they do.
Okay, that sounds like a powerful position to build from. But you mentioned a disconnect earlier, and the report seems to highlight this surprising imbalance, something about focusing too much on bulk commodity grade stuff.
That's a key point, yeah.
Yeah.
A major structural constraint, the report calls it. India has traditionally focused heavily on these big volume, basic commodity chemicals and polymers.
Can you give us an example? What does that look like on the ground?
Sure. The report gives some striking numbers. Take propylene, a basic chemical building block. In India, something like 95% of it goes into making polypropylene, or PP. Just basic plastic, essentially.
95%. Okay, is that normal?
Not really. Globally, that figure is closer to 70%. So other countries are using that extra 25–30% of their propylene for other, often higher value, downstream products.
And is it the same for other base chemicals?
Pretty similar story for ethylene, another key building block.
Yeah.
In India, 75% goes into polyethylene, PE. Again, basic plastic. Globally, it's more like 63%.
So by channeling so much into just PP and PE, what are they missing out on?
They're missing out on a whole spectrum of advanced materials. Specialized plastics for medical devices, high-tech electronics, fancier packaging, coatings, adhesives. The list goes on.
It sounds like having a really versatile ingredient, but only making one simple dish with it.
That's a great analogy. It really limits diversification into products that often carry higher margins and require more advanced technology. It keeps them lower down the value chain.
Okay, so that imbalance definitely points to some strategic issues. What are the biggest hurdles the report identifies? What's holding India back from, say, making those higher value products?
Well, like any grand plan, there are definitely challenges. The report lays out a few big ones. First off, a high reliance on imports.
Imports? I thought they were a big producer.
They are, but they also import a lot, especially certain feedstocks and intermediate chemicals. This led to a trade deficit in chemicals, around $31 billion in 2023. India has actually been a net importer since the year 2000.
Wow, okay, $31 billion deficit. What else?
Then there's limited feedstock availability domestically, getting enough of those basic raw materials reliably and cost-effectively.
Right, the propylene and ethylene we talked about.
Exactly. Plus, infrastructure bottlenecks, things like transport, storage, pipelines, and, a big one, regulatory complexities. Getting approvals, navigating the rules, it can be slow and complicated.
That's quite a list. Import reliance, feedstock, infrastructure, regulations. Is there one challenge that feels like the biggest potential deal breaker?
It's probably the combination of the way they interact. The report seems to suggest that the import reliance, coupled with the regulatory hurdles, creates this kind of negative feedback loop.
How so?
Well, if regulations make it slow or expensive to set up new domestic production, and you don't have guaranteed cheap local feedstock, it's just easier sometimes to import. But that reliance on imports then dampens the incentive to invest in fixing the domestic issues.
Ah, I see. A bit of a vicious cycle.
Exactly. So if they can't significantly streamline the regulatory side and also secure more reliable, cost-effective feedstock, getting the huge investments needed might be tough.
Okay, so the challenges are clear. But despite all that, the aspirations are massive. The report projects growth to, what, 450 billion by 2030?
That's right. And then a huge leap to potentially 850 billion, even $1 trillion by 2040.
$1 trillion industry. What does achieving that kind of scale actually mean for India beyond just the money?
It's transformative. It's not just about GDP numbers. By 2030, the goals are pretty specific. They want to boost their share of the global chemicals value chain to 5 or 6%.
Up from the current 3.5%.
Right. Become a net zero importer, basically. Produce at least as much as they consume overall. And generate somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million new jobs in the sector.
Huge goals. Are there external factors helping push this, or is it all just internal ambition?
Oh, there are definitely powerful tailwinds, as the report calls them. Domestically, you've got rising disposable incomes. They expect household consumption to grow by $1.5 trillion by 2030.
Wow.
And crucially, 140 million new households earning over $10,000 a year. That means more demand for everything. Chemicals go into better housing, cars, appliances, packaged goods.
Urbanization plays a role too, I assume.
Big time. Increasing urbanization, changing consumer tastes, people wanting more sophisticated products, and then there's the global picture.
The supply chain shifts.
Exactly. The reshaping of global supply chains companies looking for alternatives, resilience, the China plus one strategy. It creates a massive opportunity for India to step up and become a preferred partner.
Okay, so the ambition is sky high, the challenges are real, but there are also these powerful tailwinds. How does NITI Aayog propose actually doing this, bridging that gap?
The report lays out a pretty comprehensive strategy. It's built on what they call 4 critical pillars or growth themes.
4 pillars, let's hear them.
Okay, first one, tapping into export markets. This means leveraging areas where India is already strong, like paints and coatings, certain types of polyester fiber, carbon black, building on existing strengths.
Makes sense. What's number 2?
Second is growing sunrise sectors. This is about nurturing the new emerging areas, things like battery chemicals, electronic chemicals, the stuff needed for EVs, semiconductors, future tech.
Ah, the high-growth, future-focused stuff.
Precisely. Third pillar, solving for production competitiveness. This is about tackling those cost and efficiency gaps we talked about, improving feedstock access, becoming more competitive in things like EVA, styrene, phenol, nylon, some key intermediate chemicals.
Getting the basics right and more efficient.
Exactly. And the fourth theme is unlocking technology access. This is crucial. It means acquiring or developing the know-how for more complex chemicals, things like TDI and MDI. Those are used in foams and insulation, plus acetic acid, titanium dioxide, areas where technology is often licensed or tightly held.
So exports, sunrise sectors, competitiveness, and technology. It sounds quite comprehensive. Is there one of those sunrise sectors that the report seems particularly excited about, or one that could be most disruptive?
I'd say battery chemicals and electronic chemicals get a lot of attention, and rightly so. They're not just emerging. They are fundamental to the next wave of technology.
EVs, smart everything.
Right. If India can develop strong domestic capabilities here, it doesn't just secure its own supply chain for its growing electronics and auto sectors. It could become a major global supplier for these really high-value critical materials. It's a huge strategic play.
Okay, those 4 themes provide the what, but how do they actually make it happen? The report mentions specific policy actions.
Yes, underpinning these 4 themes are 7 core policy interventions. These are really the concrete steps the government and industry need to take.
7 interventions. What are they?
Okay, let's list them out. 1, Establishing world-class chemical hubs. 2. Developing port infrastructure. 3. Introducing an Opex subsidy scheme. We'll need to unpack that.
Opex subsidy.
4. Fostering technology and innovation, linking back to that tech access theme. 5. Fast-tracking environmental clearances, tackling that regulatory hurdle.
A very important one, I bet.
Crucial. 6. Securing supportive free trade agreements, or FTAs. And 7. Upgrading talent and skills in the chemical industry.
Hubs, ports, subsidies, tech, clearances, trade deals, and skills. That sounds like a truly holistic approach, touching almost every aspect.
It has to be, given the scale of the ambition.
Let's zoom in on a couple of those foundational ones first. Creating these world-class chemical hubs and improving the ports. The report talks about PCPIRs. What exactly are these?
Good question. PCPIR stands for Petroleum, Chemicals, and Petrochemicals Investment Region. Think of them as huge, integrated industrial zones specifically designed for these industries.
Like specialized economic zones just for chemicals.
Exactly. India actually approved 4 of them. Visakhapatnam, Vizag, Dahej in Gujarat, Paradip in Odisha, and one in Tamil Nadu, Cuddalore, Nagapattinam, though that last one's currently on hold.
4 approved zones. How are they doing?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. The report points out that only one, Dahej in Gujarat, has really managed to set up an effective, dedicated management board to run the zone properly.
Only 1 out of 4. That suggests some challenges right there.
Definitely. The report mentions issues like difficulties with land acquisition, getting all the necessary regulatory clearances sorted out smoothly, and sometimes international companies being hesitant to invest heavily if they can't have majority control.
So it's not just about designating an area, it's about making it work effectively. The report uses Jurong Island in Singapore as a benchmark, right? What makes Jurong so successful?
Jurong is kind of the gold standard globally. It's attracted something like $40 billion in investment. Over 100 chemical companies are located there. And their cracker capacity is massive.
Crackers, those are the big units breaking down raw materials.
Right. They break down things like naphtha into the basic chemical building blocks. Jurong can produce 4 million metric tons per year of ethylene and 2.5 million of propylene. Huge scale.
What's the secret sauce there? Why does it work so well?
It seems to be a combination of factors. Really well-developed shared infrastructure pipelines, utilities, waste treatment that companies can plug into, great strategic connectivity, be a major port hub, and critically effective governance.
How does the governance part work?
The government played a key role, sometimes even through state ownership, in supporting the development of those shared facilities and services run by third-party providers. It created a very efficient, integrated ecosystem.
Okay, so taking lessons from Jurong, how does the NITI Aayog report suggest India should set up or fix its own chemical hubs?
It proposes a pretty structured approach. First, an empowered central committee, led by the top civil servant in the Department of Chemicals and Petrochemicals.
High-level oversight.
Yes. This committee would set the overall direction, approve major incentives, both financial and non-financial, and track performance across all the hubs. They'd be supported by a new specific fund called the GVC Chemical Fund.
A dedicated fund, okay. And what about managing the hubs day-to-day?
At the local level, each hub would have its own dedicated administrative body. This might be set up as a special purpose vehicle, or SPV.
Like a focus company just for that hub?
Exactly. This SPV would handle the daily operations, work on attracting investors, manage the land allocation, oversee the shared facilities, and here's a key part: provide pre-approved environmental clearances for factories setting up within the zone.
Ah, pre-approved clearances. That addresses one of the big bottlenecks we talked about.
It aims to, yes, streamline that process significantly for companies moving into the designated zone.
What about the actual physical stuff, the infrastructure needed inside these hubs?
That's critical too. The strategy emphasizes getting anchor tenants, think big refineries or petrochemical companies, who can provide the essential feedstock right there on site.
So a built-in supply of raw materials.
Ideally, yes. Plus reliable utilities, power, water, advanced waste management systems meeting global standards, robust safety protocols and systems, labs for testing, maybe even specialized support infrastructure for smaller companies, and potentially residential facilities nearby for workers.
Creating a whole ecosystem, how are they planning to develop these? Just focus on the existing 4.
They suggest a two-pronged approach. First, revamp the existing hubs. So enhance the cracker capacity and shared infrastructure at Dahej and Paradip. For Vizag, it's about finalizing anchor tenants, sorting out feedstock supply, and fixing connectivity issues. And for the Tamil Nadu one, trying to restart the project with better planning around environmental clearance and infrastructure,
Okay, so fixing the current ones, what's the second prong?
developing entirely new clusters, identifying potential new locations in states that have, say, existing refining capacity or good port access. They mention possibilities in Maharashtra, Karnataka, West Bengal, Kerala, and several others.
Sounds ambitious. Any challenges with creating new ones?
Well, they do acknowledge challenges like high population density in some potential areas, which can make large-scale industrial development tricky.
Right. Okay, let's shift to the ports themselves. Obviously crucial for importing feedstock and exporting finished products. The report says India needs world-class port infrastructure, especially for handling tricky stuff like ammonia, ethylene, natural gas.
Absolutely vital. Efficiency here directly impacts the competitiveness of the whole sector.
India has a huge coastline, a big maritime sector. But the report points out some significant pain points compared to global benchmarks.
That's right. Take Antwerp in Belgium, a major global chemical port. Its total traffic in 2022-23 was around 286 million metric tons. India's busiest ports, Kandla and Paradip, handled about half that 138 and 135 MMT respectively.
So a big gap in just overall handling capacity.
Yes, and it's not just total volume, it's specialized capacity too. For liquid bulk chemicals, Antwerp has storage capacity of about 9.6 million metric tons. Kandla, one of India's biggest liquid handlers, is estimated at maybe 3 to 4 MMT.
Less than half. What else?
The report also mentions inadequate mechanization ports not being automated or efficient enough, and poor last-mile connectivity getting goods smoothly from the port to the industrial hubs or vice versa.
So what's the Antwerp model? What makes it so efficient for chemicals?
Antwerp is impressive. It has this vast network of pipelines, about 1,000 kilometers connecting different facilities, carrying 48 different types of products.
1,000 kilometers of pipelines within the port area.
It's an incredibly integrated system, plus great multimodal connectivity ship, rail, road, barge, and they're even investing in a digital innovation hub to optimize logistics further.
Okay, so the benchmark is high. What's the proposed solution for India's ports?
The report recommends setting up a dedicated chemical committee specifically for ports. This would bring together people from the key ministries, shipping, chemicals, commerce, plus industry experts.
What would this committee do?
Their job would be to really focus on enhancing operational capacity at the ports, optimizing the infrastructure specifically needed for chemicals, and ensuring top-notch safety and environmental sustainability. The focus would be on targeted development in 8 high-potential port clusters across India.
Got it. Targeted improvements led by a dedicated body. Okay, let's move to the next intervention. Fueling growth through incentives and innovation. First up is this Opex subsidy scheme. Can you break that down? What's Opex and why subsidize it?
Sure, Opex is just short for operating expenditure. It's the day-to-day costs of running a business. Think raw materials, energy, salaries, maintenance. Not the cost of building the factory, that's CAPEX, but the cost of running it.
Okay, so subsidizing running costs. Why is that the chosen mechanism here?
The idea is to directly boost domestic manufacturing competitiveness. Remember that $75 billion import reliance mentioned earlier. This subsidy makes it cheaper to produce chemicals in India compared to importing them.
Ah, so it directly tackles the import issue.
Exactly. It aims to make domestic production more attractive, especially for chemicals currently heavily imported, perhaps even from single-source countries, which carries risk. It also aims to make Indian chemical exports more competitive on the global market.
It's like giving Indian manufacturers a temporary price advantage to help them scale up.
That's a good way to think about it. A direct boost to their bottom line on ongoing production, incentivizing them to produce more.
How would it actually work? What's the structure?
The proposal is for incentives based on incremental sales. So sales above a baseline for a period of 5 years. It would start at 10% of those incremental sales in the first year, then gradually step down to 6% by the 5th year.
A tiered approach, phasing out over time. What kind of impact are they hoping for?
The projections are pretty significant. An additional INR 65,000 crore, that's roughly $8 and $9 billion in new investment spurred by the scheme, and an extra INR 3 lakh crore, maybe $35–40 billion in turnover over those 5 years.
And would it apply to all chemicals?
It seems targeted. The report suggests grouping chemicals by their end use, things like agrochemical and pharmaceutical intermediates, those important battery and electronic chemicals, and key petrochemicals, and applying the incentives strategically to those groups.
Okay, interesting. Now let's talk about the next piece, technology and innovation. You mentioned earlier that India lags in R&D spending in chemicals.
Yes, that was a really striking statistic. Indian chemical companies spending only about 0.7% of their revenues on R&D, compared to a global average of around 2.3%.
That's a huge gap. What's behind that low spending?
Several factors. Funding constraints, especially for the smaller and medium-sized companies, the MSMEs. A lack of strong, structured collaboration between industry and universities or research institutes,
Not enough talking to each other.
or working together effectively, yeah. There's also a lack of major industry forums within India focused purely on chemical innovation, unlike, say, the big GPCA forum in the Middle East or the Helsinki Chemicals Forum,
Hmm.
and a critical shortage of skilled R&D talent.
A talent gap in research specifically.
Yes, the report mentions maybe a 30% shortfall in skilled R&D personnel in some areas. That really limits the ability to innovate and compete on technology.
So how do they plan to tackle this R&D gap?
Again, a two-pronged approach is proposed.
Okay, prong number one.
Developing indigenous technologies. The core idea here is an R&D fund specifically for chemicals research with a suggested annual budget of around $150–200 million.
What would that fund focus on?
Three main areas. First, sustainability-led innovations. Things like green chemistry, bio-based chemicals, carbon capture and storage, or CCUS. Big focus on environment.
Makes sense. Second.
Second, process improvement innovations. Finding ways to make existing chemical production more efficient, less energy intensive. Think new types of reactors, better separation techniques.
Improving how things are made now.
Exactly. And third, developing entirely new molecules. This is crucial for sectors like pharmaceuticals, agrochemicals, specialty materials, where discovering novel compounds is key.
Who would manage this fund?
An interface agency, likely involving the Department of Science and Technology, DST, and the Department of Chemicals and Petrochemicals, DCPC, would oversee it. The goal is to ensure it supports smaller companies too, and really fosters those industry-academia partnerships.
Okay, so boosting homegrown R&D. What's the second prong?
The second prong is acquiring access to specific technologies that might be too difficult or take too long to develop domestically right now,
How do they plan to do that?
primarily by fostering partnerships with multinational corporations, the big global chemical players who often hold the patents or know-how for certain advanced processes or products.
So encouraging joint ventures or licensing deals?
Yes. The report gives examples like acetic acid production, those MDI-TDI chemicals for polyurethanes, and some battery chemicals, where getting technology access through MNC partnerships could be critical.
What's in it for the MNCs? How do they incentivize them to share?
Various ways. The report suggests things like tax breaks, grants, maybe even the government helping to subsidize the cost of licensing fees for technologies deemed high priority for India's strategic goals.
Okay, so a mix of building local capability and strategically acquiring external tech. That makes sense. Now let's shift gears to clearing the path, tackling those regulatory and talent bottlenecks. First, environmental clearances, or ECs. This sounds like a major pain point.
It really does. The report highlights this stark contrast. The official prescribed timeline for getting an EC is 255 days.
Okay, about 8 or 9 months.
But in reality, it says 90% of projects face delays. The average delay is 196 days on top of the 255. So you're looking at closer to 450 days, nearly a year and a half, on average.
And that's just the average.
Yes. It mentions some delays stretching to nearly 2 years total, compared to maybe 1 year in the U.S. or 12–18 months in the EU for similar processes. Get this, some extreme cases saw delays of over 1,000 days.
1,000 days, that's almost 3 years. Why does it take so long?
The report doesn't detail every single cause, but it points to inefficiencies in the process, back and forth between different agencies, perhaps capacity issues within the appraisal committees. The impact is clear, though.
Yeah, what is the impact of such long delays?
It massively inflates project costs because capital is tied up for longer. It creates huge financial uncertainty for investors, and frankly, it deters investment, both foreign and domestic. Who wants to commit billions if the timeline is so unpredictable?
Absolutely. So this needs fixing badly. What are the bold solutions proposed in the report?
They are quite bold. First, establish a dedicated audit committee, possibly under the Ministry of Commerce and Industries, specifically to monitor EC timelines and, crucially, publish regular reports on performance, transparency, and accountability.
Shining a light on the delays. What else?
Granting more autonomy to the Expert Appraisal Committee, the EAC, which reviews the projects. Let them make the final decision more often, or even introduce a deemed EC provision.
Deemed EC, meaning if they don't decide by a certain deadline.
Exactly. If a decision isn't made, say, beyond 270 days, the clearance is automatically deemed granted. That puts pressure on the system to be efficient.
That is bold. Any other measures to speed things up?
Yes, another interesting one. Allow companies at their own risk to start certain preliminary activities like basic civil construction on site, much earlier in the process, potentially 120 days earlier, specifically for projects involving expansion or changes in product mix where a public hearing isn't mandatory.
So let them get started on some groundwork while the final paper approval is pending.
Right. And also introducing pre-environment clearance for entire chemical parks like those PCPIRs we discussed. If the park itself is cleared, maybe individual units inside, especially if they aren't increasing the overall pollution load significantly through a product mix change, wouldn't need a fresh, lengthy EC process.
Streamlining it at the park level. What's the overall goal for the timeline?
The ambition is to get the standard EC process down to 6 months by 2026 and have fewer than 10% of projects experiencing any significant delays beyond that.
6 months. That would be a game changer. Okay, next intervention. Free trade agreements, FTAs. The report says these have been a bit of a mixed bag for chemicals.
Yeah, it's not a simple story. India has about 14 FTAs currently active, with more being negotiated. The intention is always to boost trade, obviously. But for the chemical sector, sometimes the zero-duty imports allowed under these FTAs have led to a surge of cheaper chemical imports coming into India.
Undercutting domestic producers.
Exactly, putting pressure on local manufacturers who might already be dealing with higher input costs or regulatory burdens. The report uses the FTA with Japan, the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or CEPA, as a specific case study.
What happened with the Japan CEPA?
Well, since it came into effect around FY11, Japan's chemical exports to India nearly doubled. But India's chemical exports to Japan saw very limited growth.
So the trade balance in chemicals worsened for India.
Significantly. The import-to-export ratio for chemicals between the two countries went from about 3.0 before the deal to 3.7 by FY23. So India was importing $3.07 worth of chemicals from Japan for every $1 it exported to them.
Why did that happen? Wasn't it supposed to be mutually beneficial?
A key reason cited is the rules of origin. These are the criteria used to determine if a product actually qualifies as being made in India or made in Japan to get the FTA benefit.
Fine print.
Exactly. The report suggests that the rules in the Japan CEPA often made it easier for products with significant Japanese content to qualify for benefits when entering India, but potentially harder for Indian chemical products, which might rely on some imported inputs themselves, to qualify for zero duty going into Japan.
So the structure of the deal itself favored one side in practice.
That seems to be the implication for the chemical sector, yes.
So what's the strategy now? Should India avoid FTAs for chemicals?
No, not necessarily avoid them, but be much more strategic in negotiating them. The report recommends incorporating specific provisions tailored for the chemicals industry.
Like what?
Things like using tariff quotas, allowing a certain amount of a critical raw material to be imported at low or zero duty, but keeping tariffs on amounts above that quota, or on the finished chemical product itself.
More surgical tariff adjustment.
Right. Selective duty exemptions only on critical inputs that aren't available domestically, while maintaining protection for finished goods where India wants to build capacity. Also, simply doing a better job of raising awareness among Indian exporters about how to actually use the benefits of existing FTAs and simplifying the procedures for them.
Makes sense. Be smarter about the deals and help industry use them. Okay, final intervention area. Talent and skills. This feels crucial for scaling up.
Absolutely critical. The report calls the talent and skills gap a major barrier to scaling operations.
What's the specific problem? Not enough engineers.
It's broader than just engineers, though. That's part of it. A key issue highlighted is with the vocational training institutes, the ITIs, or industrial training institutes. Only about 8 to 10% of the programs offered in ITIs currently cater to the specific skills needed by the chemical industry.
Only 8–10%. That's very low.
It leads to a shortage of adequately trained technicians, operators, maintenance staff, the skilled workforce needed on the factory floor. If India wants to double or triple its chemical output, it needs way more people trained with the right skills.
So what's the plan to fix this? Another multi-pronged approach?
Yes, a three-pronged approach here. First is pretty straightforward: expansion of ITIs. Simply increasing the number of these institutes and other specialized training centers, especially located near the manufacturing hubs, and scaling up the number of students they can train.
More capacity. What's next?
Second is upgrading the faculty. investing in training the trainers, making sure the teachers at the ITIs and polytechnics are up to speed with the latest technologies, safety practices, and industry requirements. The quality of teaching is key.
Train the trainers. Got it. And the third prong.
Third is strengthening industry-academia partnerships, really building stronger links between the training institutes and the chemical companies themselves.
How'd that work?
Getting industry input to design more relevant courses, maybe specialized tracks in petrochemicals, polymer science, industrial safety, and significantly expanding apprenticeship programs and on-the-job training opportunities so students get practical experience before they even graduate, bridging that gap between classroom learning and real-world needs.
Okay, build more, teach better, and connect it to the real jobs. Sounds like a solid plan. So let's try and bring this all together. We've gone through the landscape, the ambitions, the pillars, the specific actions. What's the final picture the NITI Aayog report paints?
It paints a picture of a truly bold vision. India aiming to transform its chemical industry from being, large but somewhat domestically focused player with a significant import reliance.
Into a major global force.
Exactly. Aiming for that 5–6% share in the global value chain, achieving a net zero trade balance, creating potentially up to 1 million jobs by 2030 alone, and keeping an eye on becoming a $1 trillion industry by 2040. It's a massive undertaking.
It really is. And the report seems clear that this isn't something the government or industry can do alone.
Absolutely not. It emphasizes the need for a concerted national effort, a cohesive approach, as they put it, that really brings together the government at central and state levels, the chemical industry itself, big players and small ones, academia, the research institutions, maybe even civil society on aspects like environment and safety.
Everyone pulling in the same direction.
That's the idea. And the timing, as we touched on earlier, feels particularly crucial.
With the global supply chain shifts.
Yes.
Oh,
We have geopolitical tensions, the push for sustainability, companies actively looking to diversify their manufacturing bases, often looking beyond China. It creates this window of opportunity.
a chance for India to really position itself as the alternative hub, or at least a key one.
Precisely. If India can move swiftly and decisively on implementing these kinds of reforms, the hubs, the ports, the clearances, the incentives, it could really capitalize on this moment and establish itself as a critical node in the future global chemicals network.
It's a fascinating prospect. Okay, before we wrap up, time for that final provocative thought for our listeners. We've talked a lot about India aiming for self-sufficiency, boosting exports, capturing global market share.
Meeting demand, essentially, both domestic and international.
Right. But as India ramps up its chemical production and hopefully its innovation capabilities through things like that R&D fund, what deeper role might its burgeoning innovation play? Could it go beyond just making existing chemicals more efficiently or substituting imports?
You mean, could India start shaping the future of materials and chemical technologies itself?
Exactly. As India strives for self-sufficiency and global leadership in production, what role might its innovation play in actually defining the very materials and technologies we'll all be using in the future? Something to think about.
A powerful thought to end on.
We've been on The Deep Dive.